So let me start this video by saying that I had high expectations going into the Callisto Protocol, a spiritual successor to Dead Space, led by Glen Schofield, the director of Dead Space, was enough to have me sold from day one. I had anticipated that this would be my 2022 game of the year, pre-ordered weeks ahead of time, and the survival horror fan in me was so excited for more modern AAA survival horror greatness. But by the end of my first few hours with the game, this was how I felt.
I was so optimistic for the first, hour and a half. And then, because early on, it's like, oh, this is just the opening of the game. It's more linear, because it's teaching me the game. You know, the melee combat feels a little weird, but that's probably just because I'm not used to it. And now at, the 3-hour mark, it's like, oh, I see what this is now. This is the game. This might be like a wait for sale for me at this point in time. Obviously I'll have to reevaluate at the end. But this might be like a get it for $30 instead of 50 kind of game. Or, sorry, 60.
But now, I've sat with my feelings for this game for a little over a month. I've replayed the game off stream, just me and my own thoughts present, and I've reevaluated how I feel about this project. I'm going to try to analyze this game in a vacuum as much as I possibly can, as comparisons to Dead Space were what initially ruined my enjoyment of this game. So join me as we take a look at what should have been my 2022 Game of the Year. So as most of you probably know by now, the Callisto Protocol was originally conceived as the first single-player game to be set in the PUBG universe. The game was supposed to be canonically tied to PUBG in some fashion, and somewhat hilariously, I never knew this until after I played it. I genuinely never even heard about this game until after the decision was made to scrap this idea, and if I'm being honest with you guys, I think I would have immediately written this game off if I had heard that in the marketing. A single-player game in the PUBG universe would have been an immediate red flag for me, and I more than likely would have kept my distance from this one altogether. But that is not the timeline we live in, so here I am making a video about my thoughts on the game that is way longer than it has any right to be.
You shouldn't worry so much, you know? You live longer.
The game's opening shows us a woman walking through the street with corpses strewn about all over the place before a street camera zooms in on her face, and we get to see a news broadcast explaining that this was a terrorist attack, and the woman on screen, Dani Nakamura, played by Karen Fukuhara, is the leader of the organization behind this attack. We then zoom out of the screen to see our main character Jacob Lee, played by Josh Duhamel, and his partner Max. The two of them are arguing as Max is really freaked out by the terrorist attacks and the amount of security measures their supplier is taking, while Jacob is telling him to just calm down, since this will be their last supply run before retirement. And maybe if I had never engaged with a single work of fiction in my life, I would believe that it would work out like that. A light comes on their computer telling them that there's an issue in the cargo hold, so Jacob goes back there to check it out, just to find out that they've been boarded by the Outer Way, the terrorist organization from the news. And wouldn't you know it, Dani Nakamura herself is here on the ship. After Jacob tries to eject the boarders, an explosion occurs in the cargo bay, leading to an emergency crash landing on Callisto. Jacob wakes up after the crash and goes to check on Max, just to find him like this.
Hey! Whoa! Jacob! Jacob! Oh, I didn't you listen. Hey, come on.
Security forces from the local prison on Callisto show up to the crash, rescuing Jacob, but also Dani, who apparently survived the crash as well. And after the guard gets a call from the warden, he suddenly takes Jacob and Dani in, both as new prisoners, to Black Iron Prison, where the rest of the game's events will take place. After being taken in, Jacob then wakes up in his cell to realize that there's a massive prison riot happening and everyone is escaping from their cells. Only, some of them aren't exactly human anymore. So among the prison rioting and the escaping, space zombies have now been thrown into the mix. From here, I'm going to give a more general Cliff Notes version of the story, only really leaving in the major plot points and things that I'll want to discuss later in the video. This is also the point where I tell you that I said Josh Duhamel wrong intentionally, just to get a reaction and maybe an angry comment or two out of y'all. Baiting engagement 101, folks. Seriously though, this is also the point in the video where we're going to leave the safety of the intro sequence behind and start really getting into it, meaning this is your big spoiler warning for the video. If you're looking to stay away from spoilers, skip to the timestamp on screen to make sure that you don't get any before you play the game yourself. Got it? Everyone here is fine with spoilers? Good. In the middle of the chaos, Jacob comes across a man named Elias who claims to know Black Iron like the back of his hand, meaning he'll be essential to actually escaping the place. Jacob helps free him from his cell before they get split up, though luckily, they can still communicate through the implants all prisoners in Black Iron are required to have, that Jacob just got implanted the day before. Jacob eventually makes his way up to the control center for the cell block, only to have an altercation with the very guard who brought him in, Leon Ferris, who is played by Sam Witwer, who is fantastic in this game.
Oh, 5, 2, 1. Look at me when I'm talking to you. What'd you do? Huh? You can tell me. Are you different? Are you special? Why'd the warden want you alive?
Elias tells Jacob that he knows of another prisoner who could hack them a ship for him to fly them out on as he was a pilot, and tells Jacob to make his way over to the Shoe, which is essentially the maximum security portion of the prison. Once there, we meet up with Elias and release the prisoner from their cell. It's revealed that Elias wanted us to free Danny to escape with. We fill her in on the plan, and she essentially tells us to go fuck ourselves before running off, leaving us to make the escape on our own. Of course, since this is a horror game, Jacob and Elias get split up again, and Elias tells us to make our way through the biodome nearby. Once we get there, we're told that we're going to need to venture onto the surface in order to reach the hangar, and we get this really awesome scene with Elias that instantly turns him into the most likable character in the game.
I never asked you. What are you in for?
What? You worried you're helping a murderer escape?
Well, yeah, kinda.
Well, you are, man. So what? Look, it's a long time ago, yeah? I was defending myself. Wrong place, wrong time. I made a lot of bad decisions back then.
Yeah, well, you were probably just dealt a shitty hand.
No. It was just to blame everyone else. But then I realized this was on me. You can't keep running from what you've done.
This is quickly interrupted by the appearance of an infected Ferris who ejects us out of the airlock, and once again, we are split up from Elias. Walking around on the surface in the middle of the blizzard, we are trying to find him until he eventually turns on his suit's emergency beacon, which gives off a blinking red light for us to follow. When we get there, we get my personal favorite scene in the game.
Keep going, come on!
No, bro. I'm done. Thank you. It's because of you. Look out.
Our only friend on this planet has just died, and quickly after, Danny swings in, cutting Elias's implant right out of the back of his neck to transfer his memories and knowledge of the prison from. Jacob tries to reason with her to work together again, which of course is rejected, and now we're on our own out here. Later on in this chapter, we enter a building and find Danny surrounded by monsters. We help her out, and she finally agrees to work together to escape. But before we drive to the hangar, she takes a detour and takes us back to the crash site of our ship from the beginning of the game. She's searching through our cargo to find out what we were transporting and is shocked when she finds out that it was only medical supplies. She accuses us of being involved with the incident on Europa from the beginning of the game, with Jacob saying that he was only one of dozens of supply ships that flew into Europa before the incident. We arrive at the hangar, and Danny reveals that she believed we were transporting a bioweapon made by the UJC, the organization that runs Black Iron Prison. We get to the top of the hangar, call in a ship, and just before it lands to pick us up, Warden Cole appears in the form of a hologram to tell us that we are not going to be leaving, shooting down the ship with his own anti-air defenses. The ship's wreckage falls onto the hangar, destroying the entire tower and collapsing it under us. This collapse ends up with us getting buried underground in the wreckage, and Danny realizes that we are close to Arcus, an old mining colony that existed on Callisto 75 years prior to the events of this story, that Black Iron Prison was then built on top of the ruins of. Jacob starts to shut down as their last hope of escaping the planet is gone, but Danny convinces him to head back to the prison to get back at the warden and get some answers about what's going on. So we decide to head through the tunnels to get to Arcus, which can get us back up to the prison. While we're wandering through these deep tunnels, it's possible to come across a secret hidden room, and this is actually a really important place if you find it, as in here there is a secret audio log that can be found, where someone who lived in Arcus is heard talking about an infection that has begun to spread, and he mentions that he needs to inform the Circle. We eventually restore power in the tunnels and use an old mining drill to quickly travel to Arcus. When we arrive at the colony, we reunite with Danny and find the burned remains of countless bodies of those that used to live there. Danny linked with one of the corpse's implants to learn about what happened here and reveals that the same infection spreading in Black Iron was the one that was spreading here, and the UJC burned the colonists alive to cover it up. We move further through the colony and come across a research station where the old lift to the surface used to be. In this station, we find recordings of Dr. Mahler, Black Iron's head of medical, talking about the large alien creature that they unearthed below Arcus, and the research they were conducting with the parasitic samples they were able to obtain from it. Through this, Jacob realizes that all Black Iron ever was just a way for the UJC to have an endless supply of free test subjects for their experiments with these parasites that they called the biophage. We have another encounter with a further mutated but still fully conscious Ferris, before Danny is infected and we continue to head back up to the prison. Once we make it back, we see just how much havoc the biophage has wreaked on the prison before being caught by security bots and thrown back in our cell. When we wake up in the cell, we get a call from Dr. Mahler saying that she has Danny up in the tower and we need to make our way up to her. She then releases the locks on our cells for us, allowing us to leave. Not really having many other options, Jacob makes his way up to her to find her trying to slow the infection rate in Danny. Mahler then explains that Warden Cole released the biophage on the prison intentionally in an attempt to speed up the rate of progress on their research and to see the infection out in the wild. She explains that this whole thing was an effort to enhance human evolution and to control the biophage in a way where we retain our humanity and still reap the benefits of the infection. He then tells us that in order to cure Danny, we would need to get a sample from the biophage alpha, a subject who has retained their humanity after mutation. Jacob and Danny then head up to the top of the tower to confront the warden, who is in a video call with a group of men wearing masks. While it is not said outright, these men and the warden likely make up the modern incarnation of the Circle, the organization that was mentioned in the audio log I spoke of earlier. This discussion leads to the warden calling in Ferris to prove to the other members that he has found the correct course of human evolution. Jacob and Ferris are to fight to the death to prove whether natural humanity or the biophage is the superior way forward. Halfway through this fight, Ferris loses control of his own body and mutates even further, but of course, he is still no match for our main man Josh Duhamel, and he is put down. Jacob then takes a sample of him for the cure as he retained his humanity, before the warden tries to cut a deal with us. The key to human evolution for our own escape. Not the worst deal, but Danny quickly arrives on the scene, shooting the warden to reveal he was never actually there, and it's only a holographic projection of him. After curing Danny, the warden initiates the self-destruct sequence, and we book it to the escape pods. Once we get there, just in case we didn't have enough movie tropes in one story, there's only one pod left. Jacob throws Danny into the pod, handing her the sample of the parasite from the research station, and sending her off into space, staying behind to die in Black Iron prison. A great ending to a really entertaining story, right? Well...
Jacob, there might be a way out after all.
Reactor for temporary safety is activated.
But I'm going to need your help.
Let me start off by saying that this game's story is absolutely full of generic tropes and things that you can see coming from a mile away. But I don't entirely feel like that's a bad thing. As someone who grew up on stories like Resident Evil, any story about some shady organization trying to further progress humanity through biological testing is something that's right up my alley. So while I might have a bit of bias here, I was actually really entertained by this game's story throughout. So much so that at the end of my first playthrough, I even said the story was the highlight of the game for me. Just because it's generic doesn't mean that it didn't thoroughly entertain me, and the writing for the characters, along with the performance from the actors, was strong enough to genuinely keep me invested throughout. I feel like I'm a little crazy for this because some people have been saying that they felt the story was weak and bland, but I guess that I'm just so attached to my generic zombie outbreak kind of story that I happen to really like this one despite its predictability. One thing that I've barely heard this game get praised for is its world building. I think that the writers absolutely knocked it out of the park here, and not necessarily because the world itself is just so enthralling that I can't help but love it, because we don't really get enough info for something like that. But that's exactly where I want to give some praise. Most games nowadays will absolutely bombard you with exposition and background lore from beginning to end in order to flesh out their worlds, but the Callisto Protocol doesn't take that approach. Take for example the Circle that I mentioned in the story summary. This organization is mentioned by name a single time in the entire game, and it's through a secret audio log. The only physical hints at this organization are also seen at the end of the last chapter of the game, and even then, they held back on having the Warden tell you to your face what the Circle is. I think that this sort of approach deserves a lot of praise because it allows the player to theorize. The game barely told me anything about the Circle, so I'm left here thinking about how it started, who's at the head of it, what role Warden Cole might play in it, why do they chant Vir Solitarius in the one cutscene, and so much more, just off of two simple hints at the mere existence of them. This is the general approach that the game takes throughout, and there are plenty of other elements that are mentioned but never really fully fleshed out the way you would expect, and it means that someone like me is not only engaged throughout the duration of the story, but it leaves me with questions after the fact that actually make me excited at the possibility of a story DLC or a follow-up title. There is one plot point that I take massive issue with though. One that was so hard to believe in context that it baffled me the first time I played. And even though I was looking for ways to justify its existence this time around, I just couldn't. Near the end of the game, when you are climbing the tower, Dr. Mahler connects Jacob and Danny's implants, meaning their memories will be shared between one another once the synchronization is complete. After Jacob witnesses Danny's memories of the Europa incident, he suddenly unlocks a repressed memory where Max asked him what they were transporting. The camera then pans over to Jacob with a sample of the biophage in his hand, and he replies, "None of our business." This effectively reveals that Jacob knew what he was transporting, and that he should have known that he did in fact cause the Europa incident, which is likely why Max is so freaked out at the beginning of the game. But the problem here is that this means that I, the player, am supposed to believe that during the opening cutscene of seeing Europa on the news, Jacob spontaneously forgets that he had anything to do with any of that for the rest of the game up until this very moment. The problem with this is that you could have used the plot point of Jacob being involved in what happened on Europa so much more elegantly and in a much more believable way. Maybe throughout the game when Danny is angry at him, he knows full well why and is just trying to hide it so that people around him like Elias don't find out. Or maybe he gets really anxious and is visibly trying to hide something while he's being thrown into black iron at the beginning of the game. You could have kept this information from the players throughout the entire game, but still had Jacob know, and even set it up as one of those elements of the story that on a first-time playthrough is surprising, and on a second you can see hints of it being thrown around from the very beginning of the game. A few smaller parting issues to wrap up the story section here. Let's start with how dirty they did my boy Elias. Throughout the early game, Elias is a character who's just there to get you to go from point A to point B and guide you through the prison, and when they finally decide to give him some character development that's actually really good and start to flesh him out as a person, in the very next scene, they kill him. These two scenes in-game, because I didn't mention it earlier, are less than 6 minutes apart. He literally becomes favorite character material, and then is immediately killed off. And it hurts. It really hurts, Glenn. Also remember when I mentioned that Danny links with the dead colonists to get their memories and find a way out of Arcus, along with understanding what happened there? Well, don't let me forget to mention that this is effectively only here to set up this one line where she tells you that the research station you find down here is new and was not in fact there as part of the original colony.
It wasn't there before.
No, not back then.
You can't hide these things from me, Glenn. I see right through your dirty little tricks, and it's lazy. And finally, let's talk about that ending. We get a great emotional send-off to Jacob, who valiantly stays back to pay for his sins and all the pain that he caused, before being told by Mahler, who was also supposed to stay and die in Black Iron because of all the pain she caused by progressing research on the virus, that there is in fact a way out. This is clearly just here to set up the story DLC that we know is coming in a few months, and just like the previous couple things, It's lazy. It's just lazy. Oh yeah, and the mutated Ferris jump scare, not only is it a cheap jump scare, but he also demutated? He was in this giant final form at the end of the game, and now he went back to his slightly buffed up mutated form from about halfway through the game? It's just weird and contrived, and I honestly have no fucking clue what they were thinking with adding this here. But for those who are just getting back to us after skipping past all the spoilers, the story is really entertaining despite being incredibly predictable, and outside of some small issues, I enjoyed experiencing the story on both my first playthrough and the replay for this video. It's not a reason to buy this game on its own, but it is entertaining and it stands with the gameplay as a strong pillar of the game. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the really controversial part of the Callisto Protocol, and that's the actual gameplay itself. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to tackle is the biggest one, and that's the combat. In order for everyone to be on the same page and the same level of understanding on what I'm talking about, let's quickly go over the mechanics available to the player, and then get into how they work or don't work. The first item you'll receive in the game is a large, pipe-esque weapon. I honestly don't really know what this is, and this introduces the melee combat mechanics. When the enemy runs up to attack you, you can hold left or right to dodge to the left or right respectively. This seems simple, but there's some nuance to it. For example, if you dodge left and the enemy throws another hit into their combo, you can't dodge left again to avoid it. You have to alternate the direction of your dodges every attack. Alongside dodging, there's also a block mechanic where you hold back to block the attack, though you'll still take some of the damage when you block. Stringing these together to avoid or mitigate damage is great, but you have to deal some damage too. So with this, you can execute a 3-hit melee combo on the enemy when you have time to, but to prevent button mashing, the devs have opted to not allow animation canceling here. If you attack while an enemy starts up their own, you can't cancel it into a dodge. You either have to hope that your attack hits first and stuns them out, or just take the damage from the hit. This means you have to be pretty careful in assessing when you have an attack window, and it leads to this little back and forth dance between you and the enemies when you're using melee. Later in the game, the weird pipe thing gets swapped out for a stun baton, and this has upgrades to it such as unlocking a heavy attack that you can work into your combos, extending the standard combo to 4 hits, lowering the damage you take when you block, counter attacks after blocking, and more. The melee combat is really simple to start out with, but there's actually a fair amount of nuance here, and overall, I think it works pretty well. A little further in, the player will get their first gun, and this is the hand cannon, a weapon that you will see no shortage of use here in my footage, as it ended up being my bread and butter for most of this second playthrough. As you would expect, you can aim and fire from a distance, but the Callisto Protocol throws in an interesting little mechanic here with the guns. If you execute a melee combo, you'll get a brief window of lock-on aim for your gun if you choose to use it, meaning you can work a shot or two of whatever gun you're holding into your melee combos. This approach is more dangerous since you have to engage with the enemy in melee distance, but can be more ammo efficient as a lot of the damage will actually come from your baton this way. There are more guns on offer here other than the hand cannon, of course. As you progress through the game, you'll find a shotgun called the Riot Gun, and if you're exploring enough, you can find and unlock a Skunk Gun, which is essentially a pocket shotgun, a tactical pistol, and an assault rifle. I never even purchased any of these 3 unlockable weapons during this playthrough, however, as I found my credits were more well spent on just upgrading the other tools made available to me for free. The last core piece of the combat sandbox is the grip. This is a tool the prison guards have that allows them to use telekinesis on out-of-control prisoners. While this works on any loose object in the environment, my personal favorite uses for the grip were just grabbing enemies and throwing them into environmental hazards, or just pulling them straight to me for a quick melee combo. This of course has its limits as it works on a battery system, but this can also be upgraded throughout the game to become more generous, leading to more frequent use of the grip. There's actually a point a couple chapters into the game that's supposed to teach you how useful it can actually be, throwing you into a room with a ton of moving mechanical parts and waves of enemies pouring in through the vents. I had already bought some upgrades for the grip at this point on my second playthrough, and I felt absolutely unstoppable here. The grip is the perfect cherry on top to the combat here in the Callisto Protocol, and I would argue that it wouldn't be anywhere near as enjoyable without it. So now that you understand the combat, what is good here and what isn't? Well, to start off with the good, the guns being worked into melee combos is actually a brilliant risk-reward mechanic, as I mentioned earlier. It essentially allows a newer player to choose to trade some healing items in favor of more ammo, or a more experienced player to just save ammo altogether if they are adept enough at the dodging system. The grip works really well not just to feed into melee combos, but also to use with the environment. Being able to immediately dispose of an enemy without risking your health in melee or expending the ammo just by throwing them into a wall of spikes or something can be a godsend in some of the combat arenas here. On the downsides though, we have some issues that are less black and white. As I mentioned earlier, I never purchased any of the unlockable secret weapons on this playthrough. Why? Because it just wasn't smart for me to do so. This game has an upgrade system using what they call Callisto credits, effectively just money to purchase them with. The problem here is how little the player is given alongside how much these upgrades actually cost. The average enemy has about a 50-50 chance to drop you credits when killed, and when they do, it will typically be between 5 to 15 credits. How much do the upgrades cost? Well, the low tier ones will cost about 300 credits normally, then the mid tier upgrades will cost around 1,000, then the high tier ones can be up to 3,000 credits. So now you'll probably start to see the problem. If I want to max out my grip so I can make better use of environmental hazards, it's going to cost me, and I calculated this one out, 10,700 credits to max out all the upgrades. So why would I want to spend 1,000 of those credits, which is a lot of enemies killed, on the assault rifle? Not to upgrade the assault rifle, keep in mind, just to get it in the first place. I should also add that the assault rifle becomes available for the first time about halfway through chapter 7 of the game, and there are only 8 chapters in the Callisto Protocol's story. So even if I got one of these secret late game weapons, I wouldn't even be able to max them out unless I had saved credits prior and gave up certain upgrades for other weapons and playstyles. But don't worry, because there's a new game plus in the game coming with release of the announced story DLC. Hold on, pause. Up until this point, you've been hearing from Cole from the beginning of this project, but here I am in the middle of editing, and literally today, as I edited this segment of the video, they released a free, ahead of plan update, including New Game Plus. This video is way too far along for me to go back to the beginning and redo this whole combat section with New Game Plus in mind. I hope that you guys understand, but I will not be covering New Game Plus in this video, even though it did come out during the production of it, because I'm already about 2/3 of the way being done with fully editing the video, and I just don't want to go back to the beginning and redo it. I might go back sometime soon and do some playing around in New Game Plus to see the combat sandbox firing on all cylinders, but for now, I'm just going to leave the video as it was, and I'm going to let you guys get back to it. Meaning that right now, as of making this video, there is no way to see the combat sandbox firing on all cylinders. And for a single front-to-back playthrough like this, you're just far better off maxing out the potential of the items you get for free than paying for extra items to add to your arsenal. In my playthrough, I was able to max out all of the upgrades for the hand cannon and the grip, which was an insanely deadly combo by the way, before supplementing with almost maxing out the stun baton and the riot gun later in the game. So rather than buying new weapons to bloat the combat sandbox with, I decided to just nearly maximize everything the game gives you naturally, which was a plenty effective build. I did, however, buy all of these weapons on my first playthrough, so even though I don't have much gameplay of them here, let me give you my impressions of them. The skunk gun, again a pocket shotgun, is just a less effective version of the riot gun, which is given for free in the chapter after you can find the skunk gun. The tactical pistol is just a weaker hand cannon with a larger magazine, and the assault rifle is fine, but impossible to get any meaningful upgrades for, since you get it within the last hour of the game, meaning it's just better to upgrade literally anything else than to buy the assault rifle. But with that fully discussed and out of the way, let's talk level design. This was my #1 issue with the game on launch. This game is insanely linear, like walking down a straight line to the end kind of linear. I mentioned here and there earlier that there are secrets, but these secrets are one-off rooms that are along the path that offer extra loot or an audio log if you go into them. So what do I think about games that have you walk through a series of hallways for 8 to 10 hours? Well, I hate them. For those that don't know me or my content, I have a degree in game and interactive media design, and I took 3 level design courses throughout my degree. And do you know what every professor would repeatedly say not to do? Exactly this. It is essentially the #1 most important thing in level design to not lead the player down a route where there is only one path with little to no deviation. Gaming is an interactive medium, so forcing a player into one form of interaction just limits it, and at that point, there wasn't much point to making it a game in the first place. I don't want to linger on this for too long and make it into a rant, but this is incredibly noticeable your first time through the game, especially if you're like I was playing on release day, having no idea that that was what you were in for. I wish that I was exaggerating when I say that this game uses this method of design with no exception from beginning to end, but I'm not. This is still, in my opinion, the #1 flaw present in the Callisto Protocol. It's just a series of rooms presented to you in a fixed fashion, in which nearly every single one will spawn a small group of enemies for you to fight before you move into the next room and repeat the process. In the upcoming DLC/sequel, I would definitely want to see them expand this design a little more. You can make it like Dead Space, where there's always one linear path that you have to go down to progress the game, but there are these large open levels where you can kind of go around and explore at your own pace, even if you don't want to just beeline it straight to the objective. I think that's the best kind of middle of the road approach here, and I would definitely love to see Striking Distance take that approach while following up on this project. The combat is definitely, as I said previously, a pretty positive point of the game, but having nothing to do aside from it makes this game pretty grueling for longer sessions, and I definitely enjoyed the game more when playing it for an hour or so at a time on this playthrough. The couple of 2+ hour sessions I pulled to get this video done in a reasonable amount of time left me wanting to do anything but playing video games by the end of them though. Compare this to when I originally streamed the game, and I would be playing roughly 4-hour sessions each time that I went on to stream it for the day. It's understandable how on my first playthrough, I had a much more negative opinion because I was kind of forced to sit down and play this for way longer amounts of time than I normally would have. And that's really unfortunate, as I normally love long sessions of horror games, as I love getting immersed in the atmosphere and spending a long time within them, feeling the weight of the world I'm being presented with. But unfortunately, if you're looking to play this game and haven't yet, I highly recommend playing it in smaller sessions so you don't burn yourself out and get bored with it. Now let's talk about something you probably wouldn't have expected considering the discussion up to this point. The Callisto Protocol has a stealth system, a very generic one at that, but a stealth system nonetheless. You can crouch to reduce the amount of noise you make, an enemy will only spot you once you're in their line of sight, and if you sneak up behind them, you get a little button prompt that you can press for a stealth takedown. Which, speaking of that stealth takedown, it's very loud. This is something that I never really engaged with until a little over halfway through the game, during the chapter called Below. In this chapter, the player is introduced to a new enemy that can't see and can only hear. These guys are much stronger than the standard biophage, so sneaking around them or doing stealth takedowns is the safest strategy. I have no problem with the presence of this stealth system, especially since it's optional for almost the entirety of the game. However, I do have a problem with this chapter. Let me present to you, dear viewer, the theory of dominant strategy. The theory proposes that even if there are many options to solving a problem, the player will always choose the statistically or seemingly most effective option, since humans are naturally inclined towards the path of least resistance. This theory perfectly exemplifies the problem with the chapter Below. Since stealthing around these guys is the best option to save heals and ammo, I would almost always choose this option. This slowed the game's pace to an absolute crawl, as I wasn't bashing and blasting my way through rooms as I had been up to that point. I was now sneaking. The devs also showcased a massive lack of restraint here, a problem that we aren't done discussing, by consistently placing like 6 or 7 of these blind enemies together in a small room and being like, yep, here you go, stealth it. I did discover, however, on this playthrough that using the grip and throwing these guys into environmental hazards won't alert the others for some reason. And since I had my grip practically maxed out at this point in the game, I generally just did this to speed up the pacing of the chapter, which did make it much more tolerable than it was on my first playthrough where I absolutely hated it. And to add insult to injury, this is the longest chapter in the game, clocking in at approximately 105 to 125 minutes for a first-time player. Meaning that, in my opinion, the part of the game that is by far the worst and most boring part lasts for about 2 hours straight. Moving on from that rant to another one though, there's also a feature that most standard enemies in this game have that I call the mutation mechanic. So remember in Resident Evil 4 when sometimes a completely normal and non-threatening enemy would suddenly have bladed tentacles burst from their head, making them go from non-threatening to the scariest thing in the arena past like the second half of the game? This game also has something a lot like that. When you're fighting a standard biophage in the Callisto Protocol, there's a chance that tentacles will suddenly erupt from their body, but rather than attacking you with them, these act as like a ticking time bomb mechanic. If you shoot the tentacles quickly enough, it will immediately kill the biophage, but if you don't, they mutate into a stronger version of themselves and have their health fully restored. This mechanic on its own is actually pretty great as it adds even more weight to the most basic of encounters, but it unfortunately doesn't work that well here. So now you might be asking, what made the implementation in RE4 better than the one in the Callisto Protocol? And the answer that I have to that is one word: restraint. In RE4, roughly 1 in every 10 to 20 enemies will have this parasite burst from their head and mutate them. In the Callisto Protocol, and I haven't run the numbers on this, it's just an estimate from my time in-game, as soon as this mechanic is introduced a few chapters in, it's roughly 8 in every 10 biophages will have this mutation mechanic come into play mid-fight. Like I said, this is a great mechanic, but when it's used this frequently, it loses all weight and meaning it would normally have when catching the player off guard. Rather than being surprised when enemies begin to mutate, I'm surprised when they don't. It ends up just adding tedium to every single encounter with a basic enemy, especially when I'm fighting them in groups. It's incredibly common to hit a melee combo on an enemy, have tentacles burst from their chest, but then have another enemy immediately initiate a melee string on you, meaning you have to tank the hits to shoot the tentacles, or dodge the damage, and have to kill the same enemy twice. This is a feature that I wanted to love and that really could have been great, but due to a complete lack of restraint from the devs, it ends up just getting added to my list of gripes with the Callisto Protocol's gameplay. But for the sake of changing up the pace on this video, let's talk about an enemy that I loved every single time. These are the Black Iron security bots. Not only do these guys have some of my favorite visual designs in the game, but encounters with them are great. The game teaches you early on that you're supposed to sneak around them when you only have a melee weapon available, but a couple chapters later, while you're sneaking, you also get a hint that you can now shoot the robots in the head for some damage. On my first playthrough of the game, I tried to do this once, before realizing that if a robot turned around on me and shot at me, it was a one-shot kill. This led to me never fighting a single one, opting to sneak by as their guns could just instantly kill me if I took the risk. And oh boy, do I regret that so much now. On this playthrough, I fought every single robot I came across, and learned that if you have the Magnum rounds upgrade for the hand cannon, it only takes 4 bullets to kill them if you hit every single one in the head. Not only that, but they are guaranteed to drop a decoder, a treasure item that can be sold at the in-game shop for 500 credits. So they're a tense enemy to fight that you rarely actually see that will reward you with 500 credits for your efforts. This is genuinely the single most well-designed enemy in the entire game. But of course, with everything in the Callisto Protocol, there's a catch. How many robot encounters do you think there are after Jacob obtains his first firearm? Give it a good solid guess. Got your number? Well, it's 2. Yep. Best enemy in the game is used twice in the entire 8 to 11 hour runtime. It's a real shame because, like I said, these are genuinely the best enemy here, and I really hope that we get to have more encounters with them either in the upcoming story DLC or in a follow-up title. This game also has boss fights, and these are underwhelming? Yeah, that's the best word for them. First we have Two Head. This is somewhat of a mini-boss, as this is a recurring enemy that you'll fight 4 times throughout the campaign, though he doesn't appear until chapter 6 of 8, so all of those fights will happen in the last 3 chapters of the game. This boss is really simple. Shoot it with your gun until he gets knocked to the ground, where you go in for a quick melee combo, execute 2 successful melee combos, and you win. Simple, right? Well, yeah, most of the time it is, but I had one encounter with Two Head on this playthrough that nearly broke me. It was during the final chapter of the game. I was fully out of ammo on both my hand cannon and my riot gun. I came across a Reforge, which is just the shop for this game, and realized that I was at the end of the game and over 1,000 credits off of any of the upgrades I wanted at this point, so I opted to just buy some ammo. I bought 6 rounds for my hand cannon and 4 for my riot gun. More than enough to just get me back on my feet as I scavenged for more in the last 30 minutes to an hour of the game, right? I entered the next room, and Two Head spawned in. It should go without saying, as this is a 2-phase boss, but a total of 10 rounds is not anywhere close to enough. So I tried to kill him, died, respawned, and decided to go back to the Reforge to buy as much ammo as possible just to get through this quickly. But the door behind me locked after I hit the checkpoint, so I had to make this work somehow. I tried using all of my ammo and every explosive that was laying around the room, and I died. I tried using all of my ammo, every explosive, and every additional biophage by throwing them directly at him, and died. Tried this strategy a few more times on repeat, and it just didn't work. And some of you are probably sitting there saying, well, why didn't you use melee or the grip? Well, it probably goes without saying, but this fella's a little too large to pick up and throw around with the grip. And as for melee, yeah, it's instant death if you even attempt it. So, I was fully soft-locked out of finishing the game, in the final 30 minutes of playing. And look, it's fine to have bosses with a specific gimmick or tactic, but I kind of hate that this boss literally just cannot be meleeed. I get that they want to make him feel significantly more dangerous than any other biophage, but I almost always stand by my opinion that bosses can have a gimmick, but if there's only one viable approach to taking down a boss, then that boss is probably not well designed. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, but generally it's one that applies fairly well. This actually comes down to a level design problem, more so than a boss design problem though. Every other time in the game that you are about to encounter a boss, including Two Head, they will give you a stockpile of ammo in the room before, just so that this very thing doesn't happen. It's maybe a little lazy and makes it obvious to the player that they are about to fight a boss, but it works for every other encounter. So I did what any other rational person would do in this sort of situation. I went to Google and searched for some sort of glitch to get through. Through this, I found out that every time you dodge an attack from Two Head, he'll take a little step backwards as part of his animation. So I ran over to one of the giant fans on the side of the room, dodged around Two Head so that he was on the fan side of the encounter, then proceeded to run straight into his body to bait an attack, dodge, and repeat this process until he eventually stepped back into the spinning fan blades and died in one shot. Keep in mind that this situation did not happen to me on my first playthrough of the game, and likely will never happen for the majority of players. The problem is that this can happen in this encounter. The fact that I had to take to Google to learn an exploit to break the game to even be able to progress is a problem that, again, I blame on the level designers here. Like I said, the level design is by far the weakest part of the Callisto Protocol. This is no exception. But with that horror story off my chest, spoiler warning in effect for the next 2 bosses. If you're someone who skipped earlier, then you're definitely going to want to skip to the timestamp on screen here to not get minor spoilers from these 2 bosses. Continuing on with the bosses, we have the mutated Leon Ferris. He's essentially just a big tank of a man that runs at you and starts swinging. He actually ends up being the simplest of the bosses, as you can just dodge his 4 to 5 hit attack string, like you're Floyd in this Mayweather, then throw some swings of your own back at him. Repeat this until the fight is over. This is a boss that you'll fight twice in the game, in the 7th and 8th chapters respectively, and if there was more to talk about here, I would, but there's just not, so moving on. For the final boss of the game, we have what I like to call Final Form Ferris. He's also really simple actually. He'll shoot a shotgun of projectiles at you from a distance, charge at you to try to impale you with his arm spikes, and oh wait, that's it. He has a protective bubble over his face that you have to take out with explosives, but don't worry as there are plenty laid about in the arena, and the game also spawns explosive biophages throughout the fight for you to pick up and throw at him just in case you run out. I also learned on this second playthrough that the explosive rounds upgrade for the hand cannon will actually be considered an explosive and chip away at this bubble. And this was an unexpectedly thoughtful and nice touch for this game. But for this fight, you just have to take down the protective bubble, then pump some lead into his face until it's over. Like I said, the best way to describe these bosses is just disappointing. None of them are necessarily horrible bosses, but they all just lack that dynamic nature and that freedom of experimentation that makes the best bosses in gaming so enjoyable. While I'm not really going to dock this game points for its boss design, they don't do anything to add to the experience either, so they're kind of just there. The best thing I can say about the bosses here is that they act as an alright way to change the pace up after fighting room after room of biophages. Looping back around to level design, it's hard not to bring this one up. Everywhere you go throughout this game, you will have to randomly perform actions to get around a random obstacle in your path, such as, but not limited to, crawling through a vent, crawling under a pipe, shimmying through a small crevice, crawling through caves, shimmying across a narrow walkway, and more. It gets so bad that during my first playthrough, which I streamed the entirety of here on YouTube by the way, my chat and I were counting out every time I had to crawl or shimmy during the underground section of the game, since between every combat encounter, there would be at least one instance of it in between, sometimes more. It has nothing to do with the combat or anything, but the pacing of the levels is slowed down so drastically by this really odd design pattern that the level designers used throughout every single level in the game. This is clearly being done as a way to unload the previous area and load in the new ones during the transition. And look, I get it, optimization is important, but there has to be a better way to do this, as every AAA game in the industry has to find weird and creative ways to optimize and load in new areas of this game. And as I'll get into soon, it's not really helping the optimization all that much anyway. In the future though, I really hope that they massively reduce the amount of times you get locked into one of these slow animations just to progress through the level. Now remember when I talked about that nightmare of a two-head encounter I had in Chapter 8? Well, what if I told you that all of Chapter 8 was this grueling? I had 4 deaths in my entire playthrough prior to this final chapter. Do you know how drastic the difficulty spike here is? I died 12 times here. 12 of my 16 deaths on a second playthrough, 75% of my deaths for the entire game, were in the last hour. I don't remember the increase in difficulty being this bad on my first playthrough, but I did decide to play on max difficulty called maximum security for the second attempt here, so that might have had something to do with it. Again, likely not something that will happen to every player, but it sure as hell happened to me, so I feel like it's worth mentioning. And I'm just going to quickly glance over this, as I'm more interested in talking about the game's actual design, as that's my area of expertise, not software development, but the performance on PC is still really bad. And look, I don't have the best PC out there by any means, but I'm just going to mention that this game is known to run at about 60 to 70 frames per second on Nvidia's GTX 4090. So in case that doesn't mean anything to you, the current most powerful graphical hardware available to mankind barely gets over 60 frames per second on this game. Alright, so I saved presentation for last so that most of you watching would be able to get a good feel for it before we got to this section. But let's talk about the presentation in this game. I don't think anyone is going to deny that the Callisto Protocol has some really great visual design, bolstered by some really great technical implementation. These are some of the most detailed environments I've ever seen in a video game, and this level of quality lasts from beginning to end. On my first playthrough, you would be passed out by the end of my first play session if you took a shot every time that I talked about how good an area looked. This is all massively helped by the game's lighting. I personally didn't play through this game with ray tracing, but the lighting still looks spectacular thanks to some of the best implementations of light maps that I've ever seen in a game before. The lighting just looks immaculate in nearly every single environment you will come across, and really adds to the overall twisted beauty and immersion factor that this game has going for it. A gripe that I do have, however, is with the fog effects in this game. They just look kind of odd and out of place. It's almost like the resolution on the fog is just too low and they aren't transparent enough, often blocking your vision straight up rather than slightly hindering it. Hell, Silent Hill 2 had fog effects just about mastered back in 2001, so it really confuses me when I see games 21 years on that have an absolutely amateurish implementation by comparison. especially when the rest of Callisto's visuals are so fantastic. The game does, however, have some really interesting screen space reflections. This method of reflections is a bit controversial in most games as they tend to lead to a really grainy image, but they really do look better here than in any game I've seen them used in before. I mean, just compare any shot of this game where I walk by some water on the ground to something like the main hall of the RPD in the Resident Evil 2 remake. You'll see just how much of a drastic improvement the Callisto Protocol's SSR implementation is when compared to most other games. Then we have the characters' facial animations and motion capture. I wanted to talk about this stuff back in the story section, but it fit far better here than there. Actors such as Josh Duhamel, Sam Witwer, Karen Fukuhara, all of these people were brought in to play main characters in the game's story, and they all play their respective roles really well. But this is made so much more believable by the stunning fidelity of the mocap work done with the actors themselves. When you watch Jacob in this game, it doesn't feel like you're watching Jacob Lee, it doesn't feel like you're watching a gamified version of Josh Duhamel, it just feels like you're watching Josh Duhamel. This is a quality that's consistent throughout the game with the main actors, but with one exception. Karen Fukuhara's character, Danny, has something weird going on with her facial capture. I can't really nail down anything specific here, but you look at a comparison between other major actors' scenes in the game and hers, and it's very noticeable, especially because she and Jacob share so many scenes when they're side by side. And it's especially baffling to me that she's the actress with the problem, because she stars in the Amazon series The Boys, and she's amazing in her role in that show. And for those who haven't seen it, her character can't speak. All of her acting there is done through body language and facial expressions. So I really have no idea what happened here. I've never been an artist or an animator, so I have no experience to even use to try to figure it out, but I would love to hear if any of you agree, because I just feel like compared to the other actors here, something is off with her capture in specific. I like to think I've done a very good job not bringing up Dead Space too much in this video, but it's going to be hard not to here. I really appreciate that one of the things that carried over from their Dead Space inspirations is the lack of an in-game heads-up display, at least in the traditional sense. Most of you probably noticed it on your own, but that little green health bar coming off the implant in Jacob's neck is his health, transitioning towards red as your health gets lower, and the blue one that appears above it when aiming is the grip's battery power. When you aim a weapon, a hologram will appear at the back of it telling Jacob and the player how many rounds are loaded in it, even turning blue when at full capacity and slowly transitioning to red when empty. You can, of course, press a button to open up your inventory, but when you're playing the game normally, there's no intrusive HUD to take you out of the game or hinder your immersion. Just things that feel completely justified within the universe and that effectively communicate necessary information to the player at all times. Well, almost at all times. I have small nitpicks here. The first one is with the grip. The full battery bar will only appear when aiming down sights, meaning that it gets thrown off to the side and is somewhat hard to read, especially in combat. And it's made even worse when you're crouched either for traversal or stealth purposes, as the perspective of the camera means that I really can't see the implant at all most of the time, and even when I can, the grip charge reading is so small that I stand no chance at having any idea how many are available when I glance here. On top of that, there's still a very standard crosshair on the screen when aiming, rather than using a laser sight like in RE4 or Dead Space. And when you end a melee combo and get that lock on for a few seconds, a bright blue target appears on the enemy to show where your lock on will aim for you. I would say that overall, Dead Space's implementation of this kind of HUD is a lot smoother and a lot more elegant than the Callisto Protocols. But for the most part, this attempt at immersion does its job and absolutely increases my immersion in the game world, even if it wasn't pulled off flawlessly in all aspects. Speaking of my immersion, let's talk about something that broke it in the early half of the game for me. This game has a small light source coming out of the front of Jacob at all times. This is clearly done to make navigating dark environments easier on the player, but it's a full-on immersion break once you notice what's happening. Even when Jacob is just some guy in a prison jumpsuit, it looks like there's a small flashlight strapped to the front of him, but if you turn the camera around, there's nothing there. This is way more forgivable in the later half of the game once Jacob has this really cool suit on, but for the first half, I feel like there could have just been an easier way to make the environments easier to navigate in the dark. I've seen some people on the internet complaining about the low FOV in the Callisto Protocol, but honestly, I think it looks great. In a game like this, having a tight, over-the-shoulder FOV makes it feel more tense, and makes you subconsciously feel more connected to your character in-world. I can completely understand that if you played this at a desk with a mouse and keyboard, This could be a little disorienting, but I opted to play at a desk with a controller, and I never had any problems with the FOV on either of my playthroughs. But overall, I would say that the Callisto Protocol is one of the best looking games currently on the market. I didn't even get into things like how great the outdoor environments look with this blizzard that's going on, something a little too familiar for those of us in the northern United States and Canada right now, how cool these suits are, or how much I love the visual design of the robots. If you're someone who enjoys a little eye candy in your video games, the Callisto Protocol will have you drooling for your entire playthrough. This level of visual fidelity doesn't come around very often in games, and the last time a game made me feel like this was back in 2019 with the release of Metro Exodus. And with that, I've talked about just about everything I wanted to with this game. As I said at the beginning, this was a project that I was beyond excited for, and when it came out, I was beyond disappointed. I wholeheartedly agree with everyone who says that this game was let down by its marketing. I went in expecting a tense survival horror experience set in a space prison, and came out with a weirdly paced action brawler with horror themes set in a space prison. Overall, I think that the Callisto Protocol is far from amazing, but far from bad. If you had asked me 1 month ago, I would have told you it was terrible, as I feel everyone else in my position would have. I was angry and let down by what I thought would be my game of the year, my true successor to Dead Space, and my new favorite survival horror franchise. After this second playthrough, I've cooled off a lot, I've taken a more level-headed look at the game. It's really not bad, it just kind of exists. I normally don't like giving number ratings for games, as my ratings are constantly changing over time as both my general tastes and my specific opinions on the game evolve and change with time. But with where I'm at right now, the Callisto Protocol is a solid 6 out of 10 for me. I can't really recommend the game at full price, but if you haven't picked it up yet, and anything here seemed particularly appealing to you, maybe wait for it to be half off or something. Your mileage may vary, but I feel like $30 USD is a very justifiable price tag here, especially considering that in a few months' time we'll have things like New Game Plus and a full story expansion to be able to dig into. Well, now that I've angered the majority of the Dead Space fandom, I think that's about enough Callisto talk for me today. If you guys enjoyed the video, please leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you enjoyed it, as this was my biggest video in a very long time. This is absolutely a video format that I could see myself doing more of, but I can't exactly do that if it's not something that's going to perform well for the channel. This video was a massive time sink, took up what could have been a lot of smaller videos, and at the end of the day, a man's gotta eat and all. If you really enjoyed it and would like to support the channel more directly, feel free to check out that little join button and consider subscribing to a channel membership. The tiers start at as low as $2 a month, and having that extra secured monthly income really does go a long way in helping to support the channel and its growth. But anyway, hopefully I'll see you guys again with whatever video it is that I do next, and if not, thank you very much for watching, and as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.